This video is really a reflection on the difference between what I feel and what I know, and how that plays out day-to-day real-life conversations about veganism, long-term horizons for vegan politics, vegan effective activism. In my life and maybe in yours. Had a conversation just 30 minutes ago at breakfast here in China, and I was not at my best. I hadn't just woken up. I woke up very early, maybe 6 a.m., maybe 5:30 a.m., with my whole body really aching from the workout I had at the gym last night. And I wanted to get to work on Chinese right away. I wanted to hit the books, start writing out an essay in Chinese. So I ate chocolate, vegan chocolate. And for me, I'm someone who avoids caffeine. I try to have zero caffeine in my diet. So to me, that's a pretty hard drug. So I was a little bit jittery, a little bit cranked up on chocolate because I ate that when I first woke up. Got a couple of hours of work done before I went to breakfast and had this conversation. So I had a conversation with a meat eater. And I've talked about on this video in the past, to some extent, if you believe veganism is for everybody, then various things follow from that, from that proposition that you want everyone to be vegan, or that you would be happy for others if they become vegan, even if someone is politically very different from you, religiously very different from you. If someone was a jerk to you back in high school, and then you meet them years later, and they've become vegan, would you be happy for them? I say that self-critically. There are definitely some people I was a jerk to in high school, and I wonder if they'd be happy for me that I'm vegan. It's all right. I don't need you to be happy for me. It's okay. But I just say on that level of knowledge, there's knowing that veganism is a positive thing for everyone, for the whole world, and I would be happy for you no matter who you are, even if you're a terrible person. Even if you're Bernie Sanders in prison, even if you're some kind of criminal, or we just have very deep ethical and political differences, I would be happy for you if you become vegan, because I know veganism is for everybody, and in some sense, I want everybody to be vegan. But in terms of how I feel on the level of emotional reality, and this connects to my own very pragmatic political attitudes, I don't want everyone to be vegan. I meet a lot of people, and I don't care. Face to face, because I think they're useless people. I think they're self-indulgent, stupid, fatuous people who are never going to accomplish anything in their lives. And when they give me their excuses for why they eat meat and why they're going to keep on eating meat, I feel like I can nod my head. It's not what I know, but I feel like, great. One less idiot. Poison leaving the body. Weakness leaving the system. I don't need you. I don't need you in this movement. I need the best and the brightest. I need highly effective, highly self-disciplined people who can really make something happen. And, this, I just mentioned YouTube has a lot to do with physical beauty, appearance, especially if you're selling diet books or what have you. And a lot of vegans want to look 110% healthy on camera just so they can represent veganism positively. Although, you can be a fat vegan, you can be an ugly vegan, that's cool. I've used the example before of Mod Vegan. I can give a link to her channel again. Doesn't cost me anything to link to her channel. Now, Mod Vegan is extremely good looking, but that's not what gets me excited when I see her channel. When I see her channel, I think, here's a highly intelligent, highly effective person who can organize lunch. Here's someone, here's someone who I can see giving a deposition at City Hall. Here's someone who I can see doing the paperwork at City Hall to book the time, to give that deposition, to present to government that argument. I was talking to someone else recently, a much younger person, but she understood within Canada, lobbying for political change in the education system. And I was talking to her, okay, if you want to influence the school board, if you want to influence public education policy, obviously, for example, so that animal rights, veganism, and ecology as linked to veganism, get covered in our education system. Okay, let's talk about, in the next 10 years, the serious steps for that. I'm interested in highly intelligent, self-disciplined, highly effective people. But from all walks of life, by the way. Doesn't require formal education. Doesn't necessarily mean you've got a university degree. You could be a high school dropout and have those qualities. In a country like Canada, that's unusual. In a country like Cambodia, all the time, you meet brilliant people, really intelligent people who never had a high school education. So, depending on where you are in the world, when I lived in places like Cambodia and Laos, I did know people with zero formal education, but who had informal education of a very high level. And almost everything I know that's worth a damn is from informal education anyway. It wasn't from my formal education that I learned the things that brought you to this this YouTube channel now. But that is a difference between what I feel and what I know. So in this conversation just half an hour ago, and I was, as I mentioned, a little bit jittery because I'd eaten chocolate. I've been up since very early, working hard on Chinese. And, this meat eater just pelts me with questions and expects me to have instant, perspicacious, profound answers to all of them. It's this game. A lot of you vegans will have been through it before. Now, in my case, I talk a pretty good game. I can't, if you want to pelt me with those questions, I can come back with answers. But of course, her response to that, this meat eater's responses, were stupid and self-indulgent and fatuous. And ultimately, her argument that she came down to, I knew from early on that was implicitly her point. Her argument was that she's not interested in being a good person morally. She's interested in living a life of self-indulgence and pleasure. That for her, the pleasure of eating a steak with her family is much greater than any ethical or ecological concerns about killing the cow, or, on a macro scale, because we're never talking about just one steak, millions of people eating steak, the impacts on rivers, the skies, et cetera, et cetera. But, as an illustration of the kind of disconnect between us, at one point she said to me, well, it doesn't matter, i.e., well, there's no point in being vegan because there will always be demand for meat in the United States. There will always be, she is saying, in effect, there will always be more than zero demand for meat in the United States. Indeed, there will always be significant demand for meat. And I responded to this. She interrupted me repeatedly, by the way, in mid-sentence. And I would let her finish her interruption. I would say, okay, now I'm going to finish my sentence. I would pick up where I left off. And sometimes I had to do that 2 or 3 times. Yes, I understand. Now I'm going to finish my sentence. But I responded to that point, the point that there will always be more than zero demand for meat, with a very specific comparison to cocaine. I said there will always be more than zero demand for cocaine in the United States. There will always be more than zero demand for nicotine for cigarettes in the United States. Now, I think she interrupted me already then, and I let her say, and then I said, okay, I'm going to finish my sentence. It took me quite a while to get out this very basic point. But what I was saying was, the comparison to cocaine, it's a contrast. I'm not saying meat and cocaine are the same thing. Her response was just obfuscatory and frankly idiotic. But, my point about cocaine was there will always be more than zero demand for cocaine in the United States. The question of what that means for government policy, for public education, for labeling, the way we have labeling on cigarettes, for criminal law, all these things, that's one category. But the question of what it means for me is actually something very different. Yes, there will always be demand for cocaine in the United States. There will always be demand for red meat in the United States. But that does not mean that I should therefore purchase and consume cocaine, or that I should purchase or consume red meat. It's actually totally irrelevant. It's profoundly spurious. So that's, from my perspective, an interesting point, but it answers exactly her point. Now, I just mentioned I wasn't posing in this conversation. I can remember having I've done research on drug policy, mostly in Southeast Asia, in countries like Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, countries where the government does not have an infinite budget to employ police officers to try to stamp out the use of drugs like cocaine and heroin. I remember one conversation with a guy who was a real scholar, very eccentric character, and I remember he actually thought that in the future drugs like heroin would disappear, partly due to government repression, but partly he thought science would invent better drugs. There'd be competition for heroin, other addictive recreational substances. I remember I said to him simply, I think heroin, it's like blue jeans. New fashions come and go, but, blue jeans remain for sale year after year. I don't think heroin is ever going to disappear from the world, no matter what government policies we adopt. There will always be some people addicted to heroin. I think there will always be some people addicted to cocaine. There will always be demand for those drugs. But that is not an excuse for any one person to use cocaine on that human level. And even all the questions that are complex about what should the government do. Some people genuinely think that heroin should be legal, not illegal, the same way that cigarettes are legal, and that the government should regulate it in a different way. The government should have this kind of harm reduction approach to try to reduce the use of those drugs. Very interesting debates in terms of political science, very interesting debates, and a lot of interesting studies on that. But all of that is actually irrelevant. to the question, you and me, eye to eye right now, is it the right thing for you to do? Do I want you, if you're my friend, if you're my brother, if you're my son, if you're my father, if you're my grandfather, do I want you to eat meat? Is it okay for you to eat meat? Is it the right decision for you to eat meat? Actually, that plays out on that same level as, is it okay for you to smoke cigarettes? Is it okay for you to use heroin? And the question of what the government is doing. You know, the difference between government policy in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, or in the United States, in New York City. The question of the attitudes of the medical establishment, of doctors, or even the questions of specific medical findings. I talked to an expert on heroin in Thailand, and he was of the opinion that medically, you know, the effects of heroin on the body were much, much less significant than many other commonly used drugs like alcohol. It was an interesting perspective. It may be irrelevant to the problem of heroin. If the impacts on your body are less, but the addiction is worse, you know, there are all these other issues. But it was, the guy knew what he was talking about. That medically, on the level of the nervous system and the organs, he actually thought heroin was less of a problem than many other drugs like cigarettes and alcohol that people commonly use. Okay, interesting, but irrelevant to this eye-to-eye, man-to-man, person-to-person conversation we're going to have about what's the right thing for you to do, what's the right thing for me to do, how are we going to lead meaningful lives, ethical lives, right now and in the next 10 years. Anyway, this particular meat eater responded by just saying that it was totally unreasonable for me to even mention cocaine, that cocaine was an extreme example, that saying cocaine was like meat in any way was stupid, etc. Now, I don't think I need to explain to this audience that I was not saying cocaine and meat are the same thing. They are profoundly different things. I was saying in this one aspect, the question of how public demand for a product shapes my choice about the product, that it's actually irrelevant. The fact that there will always be some demand for meat in the United States doesn't shape my decision. The fact there will always be some demand for cocaine doesn't shape my decision. It wouldn't shape the decision I give to my own child, my own brother, my own father, grandfather. But anyway, she basically responded to this by ranting that I must be a fool to offer an argument that dares to equate or compare consumption of meat with consumption of cocaine. All right, maybe I'm not going to respond on that level. What I actually did say to her, I don't know if it'll stay with her or if she'll ignore it or what have you. But I said, look, you have to understand these are questions of ethics. And I'm not listing everything we talked about. She also raised issues of how the animals are slaughtered and blah, blah, blah. I said, look, you have to understand from my perspective, I actually regard you in a much more negative light than the way a Catholic regards me. A Catholic is quite correct from the perspective of their faith to regard me as someone who's going to hell. However, I'm only taking myself to hell. I'm not dragging down anyone else with me. It's my personal choice. From a Catholic perspective, I'm rejecting the faith. I'm rejecting Jesus Christ as my Savior. I'm rejecting heaven in that afterlife. I'm going to hell from a Catholic perspective. But I'm not taking you or us to hell, right? And from a vegan perspective, actually, what meat eaters do is much worse. Because what meat eaters do is killing millions of animals. It's paying. It's every time they buy meat, they are paying to perpetuate the system of industrialized meat production, industrialized, animal exploiting agriculture. And they are, in a very real sense, destroying the world's ecology at a point in history when we really do not have much slack, much of margin to mess around. You personally, when you turn on the light switch, do not have a choice about whether that electricity was produced by solar power, by a smokestack burning coal, or by a nuclear power plant. You don't have that choice unless you are wealthy enough to build your own power plants or build your own solar panels. The vast majority of people every day use electricity and can't question where that electricity came from. And that does have an ecological impact. When I flush the toilet, I can't choose where the sewage goes. I can't choose the quality of the sewage treatment plant. I actually have done this. I can go to City Hall and debate with the government their plans to build a new sewage treatment plant. I've been involved with that kind of politics in Canada. I would have loved to have been involved with it in Laos. I did research related to that. It was a very interesting question in Laos. Where does your sewage go? Where does your electricity come from? But on a day-to-day basis, man-to-man, eye-to-eye, as a person on your own 2 feet, flipping the light switch, you don't have that choice here and now. And you do have a choice about what is on your fork, what is on your plate, what you buy at a restaurant, what you buy at a supermarket. And yes, from my perspective, what you're doing is much worse than merely being against my religion or against my beliefs or my values in some other sense, like Catholicism or what have you. You're doing real harm. You're doing harm to animals. You're doing harm to all of us. You are actually doing harm to our future as human beings on this planet, because ultimately we've got to share the same plate. There's a sense in which I sit down in the restaurant, you and I make separate choices, we have separate plates, and there's a sense in which we share the same plate and we share the same fate. I don't think there's any way I could communicate to her what I was really thinking and feeling, however, because the truth is, I don't want her to become vegan. I don't want to convince her to be vegan on a level of feeling. On a level of knowing, sure, everybody should be vegan. On a level of how I feel, I don't really want a bunch of idiots to become vegan. And I don't really care if I perceive you as someone who is just a self-indulgent idiot living a life totally devoted to pleasure. I don't really care if you become vegan or not, because you're not going to help the movement. You're not going to help me with my attempts to move forward as a vegan activist, as someone who wants to have a future in a real political movement, in a real community, making a real difference in the world. Whew, that's a really bleak note to end this video on.